and we can just talk about whatever we want with E3, like the announcement of Peggle 2, which I want another one of. With E3, like the announcement of Peggle 2, which I want another one of.
Hey guys, what's up? Welcome to the Blender Hangout live stream. This is the second stream of the week, so 7 p.m. Central is when I'm doing these. So thank you for checking this out. Tonight, what we're gonna do is a little bit different. I've been working on a spoon. If you guys have tuned into the previous streams, I've been sculpting a little bit and working on that stuff. So tonight we're gonna do shift gears a little bit, same sort of illustration, but we're gonna be setting up the entire basic render scene to get going on that. So we've done a little bit of layout in the past, but we haven't really done any materials, lighting, stuff like that. And so I wanna try to get some basic block in done, and that way when we're ready to get done with all of the other models, we can jump into the final render and save a little bit of time because we've thought this out. It'll also prevent us from wasting time in texturing up areas of models and things like that that aren't really going to be displayed in the final render because they're in shadows or behind something or whatever. So blocking in quickly, like we're going to do tonight, relatively quickly, is a good way to save some time down the road. So let me shift over to my screen here and kind of show you what I've been working on. All right, so I'm gonna save this real fast and then jump back to the version that I had before this one to show you kind of the process that I've been playing with here. I will be watching in the chat, by the way, for everybody watching, whether you're on Twitch or YouTube or anything like that. Leave me a comment, question, and I'll try to pause and take a look at anything that pops up as we go. So I had been laying out the scene using sort of a library and then taking all of these separate Blender files and then linking the separate objects into one big giant file. That's useful on bigger projects. In this case, with a single illustration, a single render, one frame, it's probably not that necessary. But so I wanted to kind of circumvent that, but I don't want to lose all the work I've already done. So my problem is that I imported these groups from separate blend files. These empties represent kind of where they are on the screen. And every single one of these is not a live object. And so I've got duplicates, I've got proxies going on, and I can't edit these obviously because they're from a separate file. So what I want to do is make all of these local, and I want to keep all the positions the same and everything like that, so I don't have to completely rebuild this file. So the way to do that is to select everything in the scene And I've got a mixture of objects that are some linked, some not, doesn't really matter. But with everything selected, I'm just gonna hit Control-Shift-A, and that's going to make them local, which means that they're copied into the file. So that's a great first step. The problem is we still have some of these modifiers live, some of the empties. When I originally went back and built this file, those weren't grouped into the file, and so they weren't brought over. So when you make them local, sometimes it loses the connection with the empty that you had attached to the modifier for this plate. And if that's gone, you'll end up with weird things happening. So what you have to do on top of linking everything in using Control-Shift-A is you have to make all the data local as well. So once you have all of your empties in the original file included in the group, so that's there, you want to hit Control-L, or actually just L, not Control-L. And then you can pick options here for what you want to make local. But the best option is just to select everything, select all. And now that means all the materials, all the object data, things like that, all of that is going to be brought in as well. So there's one more thing I want to kind of go over that happens when you do this, which is that sometimes you'll get multiple objects using the same user data. And this can be a problem when you want to go back and apply your modifiers. So let's say, for example, this plate is still using a modifier. It's still live. I don't need it to be live at this point because I'm happy with the plate, right? So let's say we want to keep the subsurf, but we want to get rid of this array modifier. So if I go to hit apply, it's going to tell me modifiers cannot be applied to multi-user data. And all you have to do here is jump on over to the user, the object data here. And then you have a little number next to the number of users using this object data by this name here. If you just click this, just like it is on a material or anything else in Blender, that will make this user the only user that uses this object data. And once that's been done, you can switch back over to the modifier stack and apply anything you want, and it won't be a problem. So that's just a little tip. If you are playing with linking, proxies, things like that, if you're appending to your scene, it's not going to be an issue. But if you're like me and you like to play around with Blender's asset management, that'll be good. In 2.8, just so you know, they're redoing everything with collections. And so I'll be doing a whole series on 2.8 when it first comes out with a new course, but collections will make all of this way less hard to mess with. So just be on the lookout for that. Okay, so let's switch back over to the updated file where I'm a little further along. And the goal right here now is to jump through all these objects, and I want to assign base materials. So that way I've got organization happening in the scene. My objects should be named accordingly. And I need to start making decisions about how I'm going to stick with an organizational structure here. So if you look at this object right here, which is the journal, I've got it named obviously here. And then if you jump over to the materials, you'll see all the materials have an M and an underscore preceding the name. And that's so that no matter where the data is, whether I'm in the node editor or wherever I'm at, I know that what I'm messing with is a material. And that's especially helpful if you're looking at an outliner with several sets of data and you want to make sure that that's going to be kept separate. So it's just a good habit to get in the habit of. I stuck with that from my old programming days in college. So every single material has been applied to the part of the geometry that should be referencing that material. And then I've also gone down here and assigned a viewport color just so that we can visually kind of separate things out. So if I were to go ahead and render this, we'll have to have a light in the scene. So what I'll do is just create a sun lamp. Let's render this up here on the upper right hand corner. So you can see all of the materials right now still have the same color. This isn't affecting any of that, but it's just going to help us while we're working in the 3D viewport to keep things separated. So I'm going to delete that sun lamp, and I'm now going to go ahead and continue separating out all the pieces of our meshes here. So I'm looking for modifiers that I want to get rid of at this point because we're done modeling for these objects. Anything that can be combined into an object if it's not going to be moving, and in this case it's an illustration, so nothing's going to be animated. I don't need to have all of these separate objects existing out in the middle of nowhere. So I'm just paying attention to the subdivision levels. I want to keep everything looking the same. But if these are sharing a subdivision level, then I can join these as one part of an object. And since this is the cap to our pin, that's still a separate shell, so we can join those. And this is also sharing the same modifier. So if they're the identical type of modifiers, in this case, even the settings are the same, when I join them together, it's basically going to use whatever the active selection was and keep that modifier active. And so you're not going to notice any change as we jump in here and play with combining these together. So all of this is now one single object. This little piece is also part of this pin cap. And we didn't model the inside of this pin under the cap because this cap is going to stay where it is in the scene. And basically, if we want to leave these disconnected, we can. In this case, I don't see a reason to do that. So I'm going to combine those. And then here, we've got a separate subdivision level. So in this case, I'm going to keep this separate. This doesn't have any modifiers, so I don't want to combine this in with this right here. We don't need the mirror modifier anymore, so we can apply that. And you'll see we still got that error, so we got to get rid of the user data. So we'll make it a single user. Now we can apply this. So these share, and that's not going to move, so we can combine this. And just to visually kind of get things out of the way that we've already messed with, I'm going to select the stuff here and hide it, so I know that I'm done with that part of the pin. And then we can look up here, and this is a separate piece. Doesn't really need to be sharing any of the settings because these are different for the modifiers. We'll hide that, leave that alone. This is all technically one piece. So I'm going to combine those together, hide this, and then that is a separate piece as well. So we unhide everything, and now we have our pin object. So if we want to move this around, the best way to do it at this point would be to go ahead and parent all of these separate objects to an empty, and then we will be able to kind of move them around as a group and not have to worry about grabbing this and forgetting the pieces up front. We could also just parent these to this base object if this is the one we know we're always going to be picking up. But in this case, an empty would probably be better. I'm not going to worry about that right now. If I feel like I need to move this around, I'll do it then. But at this point in time, what we need to do is start assigning materials. So let's jump over here. Everything has been assigned a clay material. And so anything that's still pink in the viewport, I know that I still have to work on it. And that's just another way to kind of visually keep things separate as we go. So now I need to start looking at my concept art and breaking down what all materials need to be included here. So I'm just going for broad strokes, basic materials. I'm not going to worry about things we can't see because they're only part of a texture or things like that. I'm just worried about how to separate out big ideas. And so at this point, we know we're going to have whatever the body of the pen is made up of, and I think it's going to be some sort of resin type of material. So we'll do an M_blue resin, and then of course we want to sort of give a representation of that in the 3D viewport. Now you'll notice nothing changed, and that's because we haven't applied this material to any pieces of this mesh yet. So if we jump into edit mode, we need to grab all the parts of the body that need to have this applied. So this is where we get to start making decisions about what we want to kind of be represented by which materials. And if it's not obvious by the concept art, we get to make those decisions right now. So looking through this, I'm trying to avoid pieces that I know I want to kind of make metallic. So I know this part up here for the cap is going to be part of this material. I think I'm gonna make this part of the material as well. And then in here, let's start with these on the inside. So we'll just go ahead and assign that. Kind of see how that looks with the breakup. That's nice. This is also going to receive that same material. So rather than getting rid of the clay and then swapping it out, I'm just going to go ahead and swap it out for the material that we have now. So it's in blue resin is what we're looking for. Now, a lot of the other pieces that are on this pin are going to be kind of a chrome or a sterling silver type of thing. And so starting up here with the tip of the fountain pen, I'm going to create another material, call this M. Let's do shiny silver. And we'll create two different kinds. So at this point, I'm gonna make this really bright white. So that's now automatically applied because we have only this one material in this stack now. So now we can look for other pieces that need to have this material. Also want to have this sort of really shiny material on this piece right here. So don't need okay. So that's part of the body, that's why. All right, so let's go ahead and add in another material, or in this case, maybe we just replace this with the silver. So that's also the same material, and that's the kind that I want there, so that's good. We can jump down and see if the rest of these are playing out the way we want. It's not this way in the concept art, but I kind of like that little accent right there, so we might leave that. This clip is the same sort of silver, and so we can play with that. So I like the way this is contrasting. I think that's a good way to keep this right now, and so yeah, that's a good start. Okay, so there's a couple more materials we need to add to this. So we'll do a let's do a diamond material. Do a white diamond. Just to differentiate what this kind of looks like, make sure I make it something other than just white there. And then this is going to be sort of a black metal or a black plastic. So let's add a material. And I'm only adding materials a lot at this point because we don't have them already existing in the scene. So anywhere else in the scene that we have something we can use, we're obviously going to be using that as we go. So we're going to do... It's the 1920s, so I'm weary about using plastic because I don't really know if they had it back then, and I'm pretty sure maybe. So I'm going to use metal in this case. Don't really know. It's going to be sort of a black and not very shiny metal. So something like that. Okay, it's a little too black. I want to make sure I get a little bit of shading on that, so brighten that up a little bit. Okay. Last thing we have is the tip right here. We can't forget. Now this is actually a little bit different material. I'm not exactly sure what kind it is. I didn't do tons of research on fountain pens to do this part of it. I do know that it looks different from the reference, and so I'm gonna say that it's I'm just gonna call it a rough silver. It may be some kind of separate kind of metal. I'm not really sure. So let's go ahead and add this in. And in this case, rather than going bright white, we're gonna go a little darker. Just so you can kind of tell difference in the shade there. And that's kind of the whole process. So we're gonna keep doing this around the scene, and eventually we'll get it all done. Don't know how quick I can do this, but it shouldn't take too much time. So in this case, this is gonna be an amber. This one is gonna look quite a bit different. Something like that. And then these are maps, like rolled up maps underneath this. So we have parchment paper, or actually interior sort of pages for the journal here. Need to make sure I follow the naming convention there. So there we go. Don't need the clay anymore on this. We're gonna remove that. So we need to decide whether we want to keep the same kinds of pages for this interior page as this. I think I want these to be a little bit older, so maybe we'll call it parchment paper. So let's create a new material. And this time, we're going to go a little bit more yellow with the way this looks. Like that. So you can see even between the interior paper, these maps, and this postcard, we've got really different visual representations in the viewport, and that's really going to help us keep things separated so it's easy to select things and all of that. Okay, this is the little sugar bowl dish. So this is going to be some sort of glass. So we want to do, say, a blue glass. So it's got kind of a cast there. This is going to be that shiny silver again. So this time we'll just swap this out. These are sort of its currency. So I haven't really decided what kind we're gonna do yet, whether it's gonna be American or what. But in this case, we need to kind of have something to represent that. So typically be some sort of green. So we'll try that. Okay, now these are already set up to be specific denominations, so you can see by the labeling here that this is a dime. So I'm going to make sure all of these names are still following what they need to be as we go. There's only one kind of each of these, so in this case, this is going to work. There's 2 quarters here, so just label these like this. Okay. Now each of these will need to have its own separate material because we'll have to do a little bit of different coloring, but also, obviously different textures and all of that. So we'll go ahead and create separate materials for these right now. May be able to copy certain attributes from the node tree from one to another. I'm not really sure yet, but can at least start with this. So what I'm going to do is select, we already have a quarter. All of the silver ones, like a dime is still silver. I'm going to go ahead and select quarter. In this case, we'll just make a separate copy right there. We'll now just name this dime. Nickel will be the same way. And this one's a penny, so we'll create a new material. Give this sort of a copper color. Something like that. Okay. Almost done here. So we've got a spoon here. Now, this is going to be a little bit different type of material than our shiny silver over here. This is going to be more like a sterling silver, but I know I want to add some wear and some tarnish and things like that. So I'm going to create a separate material for this one. Call that sterling silver. Make this one a slightly sort of greenish tint. Okay, it's a little close to the currency color, so I'm going to shift this back towards maybe the blues, something like that. This is going to be T, so let's create a new material. Something like that. And then we have sort of these fine china pieces right here. I'm going to give these the same basic material to get started, and then we'll separate those out as we go. So let's make sure we have china material. And in this case, let's just leave that. So all three pieces here are gonna get that color, and there we go. Okay, so to the best of our ability at this point, these are all kind of separated. And now from any view, it should be fairly simple to see kind of what's going on here. So the last step I'm gonna do is run through after I save and make sure that I have everything labeled accordingly. And to help me with this, I'm going to split this window and create an outliner so I can see a list of all the objects in my scene. So all these dollar bills need to be named. And what this is going to do, aside from just being, hyper, organized, is it's going to tell me if I have duplicate objects. It's going to tell me if I have anything else in my scene that I forgot was there, backups, any of that kind of stuff, which I don't want to have right now. So this empty, we got rid of the modifier stack, so we don't need this anymore. So each of these separate little maps has its own piece, but those are together. So this is an old piece, and that's actually the, call this the fossil. These just need to be basic maps. Looking for random, objects that are just called plane, cube, things like that. In this case, we have our pin body. Pin diamond. Pin feed. And pin will be sugar dish. We'll do rim. Awesome. Okay, everything else is already named. Cool. So now we got everything organized. We can get started with setting up the scene, lighting it. Okay. So, looking at the concept art. One thing I want to share a little bit before we get going is if you're just tuning in and you haven't seen any of these yet, my name is Brandon Hicks. I'm a Blender Foundation certified trainer. And so these are the streams I'm kind of working on right now. So this is my new site called theorangeguild.com. If you're interested in learning more about Blender and you're a hobbyist or even a professional that is using Blender on a regular basis, you want some training, you want to get your hands dirty, you want to be able to keep up to date with the new changes and things with 2.8 and all sorts of things like that that are happening. Theorangeguild.com is a great website to help you with that. So basically you can come to the website, you can join for free here, and we're going to have tutorials that we're going to send out to you through email, free courses, things like that. If you go to the training section, you can see all of our courses that are available that are paid courses. These are available individually to purchase, but the cheapest way to access all of these together is through our monthly membership. So if you go to the membership here or at the top there, you can see what you get for joining. We're going to be constantly working on this throughout the year. 24/7 access, all the courses are available. It's $19 a month, or you can save a little bit, spend about $200 a year on this. And you get all these courses that I currently have available, and we're continually working on more and more. So it's a great deal. I'm available inside with our questions and critiques area if you want to have your portfolio reviewed, or you're working on projects and you get stuck with something and you need some help. I'm there 24/7 to answer questions. So you can jump in there and ask me, and I'm available to you to kind of mentor you through whatever you're dealing with. All right, guys. Thanks for listening to my little pitch there. Back to the project. Okay, so we don't have any lights. If we start running this right now, we're not going to see anything. I've turned off everything to make sure that we're not using any kind of ambient occlusion. The world background is turned all the way down to 0. All the settings are basically down to nothing getting started. I am using my GPU, so if you have one of those, I would highly recommend you do that. If you jump into your user preferences, Control-Alt-U does that. You can jump over to your system and then check off whatever graphics card you want to use. In this case, I'm using 2 AMD cards. So make sure you click Save User Settings so that will be your default, and that's how that works. Okay. So if you guys have any questions as we go about cycles or anything you want to kind of focus on as we get in here and do this, let me know and I'll stop and try to address anything. So let's look at the concept art again. That is our roadmap to success. And let's take a look at this. Okay, so we got a very moody atmosphere kind of happening here with the scene. And what I want to try to nail right now is if we don't have any materials and all we have is clay, and that's what we're looking at, even with just lighting being correct, we should be able to get a really moody atmosphere with shadowing and all of that happening with the interactions on the scene, because we already have a lot of stuff going on in the shot. So let's talk a little bit about camera before we get into the rest of the shot. So from this angle, it's a top-down angle. We're looking down onto a desk, and it's kind of a shot composing a still life of various objects from somebody who is coming together, and they're sort of like an Indiana Jones type character, right? So they've got an archaeological journal that they have notes in with treasure maps and all sorts of things going on. These different pieces are in the 1920s, and so you've got like an old school Art Deco fountain pen, this amulet that you see laying across the book. There's even a drawing of it in the journal. You can see all of that happening, and so all of this to say, we want to capture the best way to showcase this as possible. And so we're going to be trying to think about the camera angle and what we need to do to get the same basic view for our scene. It looks to be kind of a more telephoto look. So that means we're going to want to use a higher focal length on the camera. It also looks to be fairly moody. So we're going to want lights that provide softer shadowing, kind of hide certain objects in the shadows, and then reveal details in the lit up areas. So maybe that means some spotlights will work better for our purposes here. But I think we're gonna have to play around and kind of mix and match, and that's kind of what tonight is for. So, all right, so we've got lots of time. So let's get in here and start playing. So with this still going in the upper right-hand corner, I've got a live cycles view here. You can start adding lights and just kind of see what's happening. Now it's going to be important as we go to remember that as we start lighting this up, it's never going to be a perfect representation and give us a good reading of things until we start actually adding materials in there that sort of get close to representing the final versions, because things will obviously behave differently with transparent things like glass and all of that. So we also don't have every object in the scene that we're going to have in the final. So just want to move quickly and kind of get this going. Now I do have the filmic turned on in terms of the color management profile. It's a more accurate way to represent the colors the way it would be on film. And so if you're using the normal version, this is going to be set at default, and it will change the way your light intensities and all of that stuff react in the scene. So pick one of these and stick with it. And in this case, I'm going to use filmic, and then I'm going to leave all these other settings right here alone until we get to the final part of tweaking the scene. But so if you want to follow along, I am using that. So the reason why that's important, and I just kind of mentioned it a little bit, is that your lights are going to need to be much more intense if you're using something like filmic. So you're going to have to crank these way up to be effective in the scene. And so in this particular case, again, we need to look at our reference a little bit. We know we're going to have this amulet sort of model sort of right over here in front of this this journal. And I want to turn up the blend so that it's very soft on the edges. Now let's go ahead and crank this up to something like 3000. Okay, so if we drop the cone size, it's going to make that a little smaller. And you can see what we're getting is a fairly shallow fall off, but the shadows are still, kind of harsh. If we look at the edge of the teacup and things like that, it's a little harsh. So I hope you guys can see that. I'm keeping it small so my computer won't crash as we stream. Maybe we can make this a little bigger so you guys can see this. Okay. So if we change the size here, that's going to affect the size of the shadows. So if we jump up to something like 1, you're going to get a much softer transition from one to the other. And honestly, we need to play around and kind of see what we like here. So I'm going to increase the intensity even more. Okay. Check that out. If we pull back further, the light is going to dim because of the inverse square law, but we can compensate by making it brighter. So there we go. So it kind of looks like, from the way this is laid out, and maybe we have scattered spotlights overhead that are lighting this up. Maybe there's something from a window that's pouring in. I often kind of wonder what the surrounding scene would look like. Maybe that was in a library with stained glass windows or something cool like that that would create some nice caustic effects on the the journal and all that sort of stuff. So we'll just have to play it. We have to make it interesting. And so the key to that is variation, contrast, and making sure that you have some interesting stuff happening in the scene. So we're going to want to mix light types probably. You're definitely going to want to vary the intensity. But there needs to be some logic to it, right? So don't want to have every light be the exact same intensity. So in this case, maybe we drop this one down to 3000. And even with just these two, you can kind of see how we're getting that moody feel as we get going. And what I like about this is that we're getting some of this lost in the shadows. And so by using the shadows with the light, you can tell a story, right? And so that's what we need to be thinking about as we get going here, is how we're going to tell this story. So one of the other things we might do is maybe we want to not drop all of this into shadow, but maybe we want to have a different kind of light coming from behind the teacup or the objects over here, because we can't even really see the money or anything laying on the desk. So let's just say there's a window back there. Let's create something. We could use an area lamp, or we could use a big mesh light. In this case, I think I'm just going to use a mesh light. So to do this, we will just start with a plane, make this really, really big, make it wider than it is tall, and then I'm going to rotate this so that it's standing up like that. Move it back here, make it real big, and let's play with this and how it looks in the scene. Okay, so I'm gonna have to start using cycles a little bit here so that we can get a mesh light going. I'm gonna switch to the node editor, make sure we're under materials. And right here, I just wanna say, in this case, I'm gonna use L underscore for lamp, and we'll do, well, actually, it's still a material, so let's do an M underscore, and then we'll do light window. Okay, so we need to swap out this diffuse shader for an emission shader. So we can select this right here, drag this over to the surface, get rid of that. And now you can see just by leaving this at 1, we've already got sort of a window light pouring in from behind the scene. So this will change drastically depending on the shape of this light back here and also where we move it. So what's great about this live update is that we can kind of play with the position, just move it around and see what it does. So if we put it over here, you can see we're kind of getting some rim light effects on the back of these objects. And that's casting a shadow. So all those little coins are being picked up. And then one other thing to mention at this point is that if it works this small on the screen and I can tell the silhouettes are there and they're reading okay, then I know when I blow it up big or I get into further advanced material settings and stuff like that, and we actually start shading this stuff, I know it's gonna work, right? Because if I can read it in black and white or gray from this distance, then it's not gonna be a problem when we start moving on later down the road. So let's see, we've got it straight up and down. If we tilt it, we're gonna get a little bit more light from something like above. So that might help a little bit. And we have to just decide, you know, does this sort of correlate to the concept art the way we want it to? Is it better than the concept art? You know, are we losing something? You can also play with shapes. So let's say we want to create multiple lights. You could just duplicate those out like that. And now we're going to have multiple big light sources sort of coming in this way. So this is kind of interesting over here. To ask ourselves, do we like what the shadows are doing with all these objects? I definitely think it's more film noir type moody with the way this is being lit. And we want to make sure that we're showcasing the hero object in this scene. And in this case, it's not even here yet. It's going to be this amulet that's sitting right here on the journal. So our brightest part of the scene is probably going to be right here. And then we're going to kind of highlight other areas that we want to showcase, but nothing will be as bright as this one area there. And we also need to question at this point, are we happy with our camera? So we mentioned it being sort of a telephoto look, but in this case, we've got much more distortion going on. And so when I originally set this up, I did this for a reason. And I'll mention that as I kind of get in here and play with this. So if I was to duplicate this camera and then change the focal length to something like 100, and then I was to jump into that camera instead of this one, now we're going to have to pull back to compensate for the shift in focal length, because that'll zoom you in. but let's jump back to the other shot and then just make sure we're kind of in the same focal length in terms of the framing. So if I really quickly control 0 on the numpad, it's pretty close. Kind of see where we're at. So we're losing a lot of the distortion with the longer focal length. It's much more top down instead of sort of 45-degree angle in. Now, this is exactly the same angle in terms of, you know, where it is pointing to the scene. It's just that it's, you know, it's a different focal length. So that's changing the way that we're seeing things. So in this case, maybe we can stick with this and try this out. And ultimately, it's going to come down to what is kind of more dramatic and works better for the scene. In this case, with a wider focal length, we're us getting closer. Objects that are closer to the lens are going to be a little bit more distorted. So these seem a little bigger than the objects in the background over here. Not much, but a little bit. And in this, we get much more, you know, sort of orthographic kind of one-to-one representation of those objects. So yeah, let's play with that. Okay. Now you can overlight the scene too. And so we want to play, but we want to make sure we're not getting too crazy with what we're doing. So even by just adjusting the height of this lamp, because it was dimmer, let's say we go down to 2000 instead of 3000. So it's falling off a little bit more into shadow over here than it is over here. But if we lower this, because it's closer to that object again, we're going to get more intensity, but it's more isolated. So it's more down here. If we want to isolate it even more, we can lower the cone angle. So we're just getting just a highlight on the edge of this. And this might be kind of cool because the amber is going to be kind of like glass in this case. So if I jump into a top-down view and I reposition this light, this lamp right over the top of our amber, that's interesting. So we could leave this here. We could also tilt it a little bit so it's just slightly off kilter. And that way when we get those refractions happening with the glass, maybe it's a little bit more interesting. We won't really be able to tell until we play with that. But yeah, kind of see what's happening. We've even got a little bit of a shadow from that edge of that rolled up map falling on the amber there. So that's kind of cool. At this point, we need to look around and see what else is kind of getting lost. Is it getting lost on purpose? Do we like that it's getting lost, or is it not good? In this case, we might play with lighting up this part of the scene a little bit more because it's not really doing much good right here. So let's duplicate this, move it over. Drop that down to about a 1000. I'm also looking at the concept art, making sure that if I had any shadows in the original, that maybe there's a good reason I put them there. So I want to make sure that I kind of keep some of those interactions happening. But what's cool about this is we got little pools of light starting to happen around the scene. And that's kind of, you know, in line with what we want with the concept art. Now, something else cool that you can do is you can actually create objects that are in front of these lights that cast shadows, but don't show up in the render. So I've got a bit of a long shadow happening here. And I'm not really sure why I did that. Maybe it was from cast shadow from this this teacup, if it was backlit, coming down to the desk here. But it could also be something that's hanging above in the scene that's just kind of blocking the light a little bit, that's close to the light source. So in this case, maybe we want to do a, let's call this a flag. And so if we were on a film set, that's kind of what they would call it, as a flag. So I'm going to want to kind of create something like this. That's just a big plane. In this case, I want to add a cycles material. I'm going to call this black flag. And this needs to be a holdout material. Well, it doesn't need to be a holdout material, but it needs to be something very, very black. So holdout will do it. Let's see what that does there. We could also just leave it as a diffuse and make it a black diffuse. And so there's some things you can do. It needs to be behind the camera. And in this case, our camera is way up here. So it needs to be behind the camera if you want it to do that. And then you'd have to have a light above it to cast a shadow down on top. You can also turn off a parameter that hides it from cycles. So if you jump into the object preferences here, down to cycles settings, you can open this up and then you can turn off camera visibility and that will hide that from the camera. So you can see as I move this around here, what effect it's having. In this case, I'm gonna put this below the light probably. And let's move this around. Yeah, there you go. You can see the shadow updating on across the journal as it's moving right now. Okay, so let's shrink this down. And there you can kind of see how it's falling across, more like the concept art. If we look right here. Now that's too strong. We want it to be more subtle than that. And so what we can do is actually, we can keep playing with, the height and all of that in terms of how close it is to the light and stuff like that. But an easier way to do this would just be to create a mix shader and a transparent, and then we can kind of play with the opacity of the material. So all the way to the left would be completely black, and then we can turn up the transparency all the way to 1, which would effectively remove it from the scene if we did that. So if we want to just dial back the intensity of the shadow, we can just bring this down to something more like that. And it's not going to make the shadow any softer. So if you're not happy with the edges, it's not going to help you very much there, but it will create a less intense shadow. So let's say that we want to play with how this is shaped a little bit. So we can bring those sides in there. So now we've got more of a cone shape happening. So this is kind of fun. We're inventing shadows in this case. So let's change the rotation of the 3D cursor. I just want to shift this a little bit. So in our concept art, we get a little bit of a cone shape happening, and then we get a little bit of a highlight there. And so rather than adding a light, let's just see if we can knock it out with the shadow and see if we can dial that in. So yeah, something like that. Not bad. Cool. All right, so let's play a little bit more with some of these settings. Still not super happy with the fact that all of this is getting lost. Now I know that the currency is so thin that you'd have to have, a stronger light to be able to tell those are even there from the edge. But let's play a little bit with a rim light of sorts. In this case, instead of a mesh light, I'm just going to use an area light. turn this back to medium point for the pivot, and then I want to rim light everything on this side. So I'm just going to lower. All right. So by hiding and unhiding, I can kind of see what effect it's having here. In this case, I want to turn this up. Multiple importance is going to be good to have on because it's going to reduce the noise if we have glossy materials in the scene, and in this case we will. So that's going to be on there. That's good. There's also a setting in the render preferences. Let's see if I can remember where it is. Maybe it's the world settings. Yeah. Okay, so let's go back to the settings for the lamp. And by keeping this down to 0.1, it's going to be pretty harsh. So turn this up even more and see what it's doing there. Yeah, so even more light coming in there. Now here it's starting to compete a little bit with this side. Not a ton, but enough to perhaps be an issue. So we need to kind of be aware of that. Move this around a little bit and see if it looks better from different angles. Yeah, so it's getting washed out a little bit in here. So that's a little something I don't want to happen. In this case, I like that we have some variation happening here with the shadows, so I don't want to soften them up too much. Split the difference at 750. Okay. Now, something I don't like that's happening in the upper right-hand corner is that it's kind of washing out this entire side. It's drawing the eye up here, but it's leaving you in this corner. And even though the composition kind of tries to avoid that, the lighting can also screw that up. So I'm going to use the same principle I used to create the shadow here, and I want to drop a shadow in over here too. So I'm going to duplicate this object, and then I'm going to play with ways to affect the lighting over here. So you can see it dimming a little bit there. As I drop this closer to the ground plane, we're getting bit more there. I'm just going to turn this into a triangle because it's going to be a non-planar mesh, so it's be a little easier to work with if it's a triangle. Okay, so we got some more of that vignetting happening back there, which I kind of like. Now, the closer we get to these objects and away from the light source, the harsher the shadow is going to be next to it. So I don't want to get super close. You can also see if I block out too much of the light, I'm not getting anything bouncing around the scene. And that's not really what I want either. Okay. Something more like that, where it kind of parallels the edge of that. Okay, just by raising this up a little bit, we get a little bit more dimension there happening. So that's not bad. I feel like we need a little bit more light here on the journal so that the pen's not getting completely lost in this edge here. I like that it's doing some interesting shadowing there, but I don't want it to be totally lost. So it's a weird mix. You don't want to completely overlight the scene because it will just completely wash everything out. But you also don't want to go so contrasted that you're losing things in blacked out shadows or blown out highlights. And so washing the scene a little bit to where you're just above too dark or just below too bright is kind of where you want to be, because then in post you can go in with a an HDR image and completely add contrast and do that. But you can't take it back out once it's in this shot. And that's an important thing to remember as you're focusing on rendering things, is that you want to give yourself enough latitude to play with things when you're creating these scenes. So I'm going to duplicate this this lamp one more time, this spotlight. Take this way down to about 1,000. Drop this right down on the pen down here. And this I'm going to want to be a bit more harsh of a shadow. So let's just go down to 1 and maybe 0.5. Okay, now looking here, it appears that we have maybe the light coming a little bit from behind it and to the right, or maybe a little bit more directly over. So we'll see kind of how that works. Jump into the top view, the pen over here, tilt this slightly this way. So I want to try to cast that shadow there. Now, I want to drop this below the shadow casting object, the flag that we have here. There we go. Drop that way down. Okay. Still want to make sure I'm getting some part of that casting shadow on the pen. So pull this right up next to that shadow caster object. Make sure we're looking for the edge here as we play with the size of the spot shape. So we need to pick kind of where this is going out to. In this case, somewhere about halfway here, maybe. And Okay. In this case, maybe the spotlight is not the best lamp type. So we could try point. Problem with the point light is that it's going to light everything up. So a mesh light of some type might be the best way to deal with this. But let's keep playing a little bit here. So if we drop this low, we're definitely going to get those harsher shadows. And point light's more like what you'd see with a light bulb or a candle. So if we added something like a candle into the scene, it would actually be appropriate to have something like this here. So maybe we could play with that a little bit. What I kind of like about this is it's almost like there's some light emitting from this object that's sort of pulsating out over to here. And in this, you get a little bit of the blue shadow. Now this is probably bouncing from, this blue object here, but the whole scene just feels a little colder because of this object. So play with that as well. So far, we haven't really played with color, but that's also something we could start messing with. So I like this shadow a lot better in terms of how that's working with the scene. Now we're still getting way too harsh of shadows here, but I think I kind of like what that's doing. So maybe we need to lower the intensity a bit. And then let's drop in, rather than just filling that up with another point light, let's take another area lamp and light from this side. So we get a little bit more of a 3-point lighting scenario going on here. But this is going to be a pretty dim light, so let's start with 200. Now this is going to get casting a shadow here from the back. In this case, I don't know if I really want that, so we're getting a shadow here from, again, this light. So shadows are good. We just need to decide, what kind of shadows we want and what's worth having. Also, this shadow is very linear right now. And so if we want to soften this up, we need to increase the size. And if it's just a fill light, softening that up quite a bit can be good. So maybe use something like 5. Now, the more you do this, the more it's going to have to diffuse that. And obviously that's going to add some noise to the render. So just be aware of that, is you're going to have to kind of pay the price a little bit for that. So since we moved it closer, I'm lowering the strength of the lamp, and I just want to fill in this edge a little bit and some of that. Now, I don't want to completely lose what's happening here, so we need to kind of walk carefully with this. Okay, yeah, we're getting to a point where it's just kind of washing everything out, so don't want to do that. Maybe a better way to go about doing this would be to aim it down the side of the journal here. Okay, you can kind of see what's going on there. Right down here, it's getting a little bit brighter. Maybe in this case, we could try a spot instead. Let's see how that works out. Yeah, that's a little better. Leaving some of the harsher shadows in here, so I think I like that. Paying attention to the shadow edge right here. Making sure I like how soft that's coming off. Also may need to turn up our render preview so that we get enough samples there to see what's actually happening. Okay, it's give and take. This is definitely bright enough that it should be casting a pretty defined edge right here, but if this is too soft, you're gonna lose that. And so you have to just decide, you know, what you kind of want there. So one of the other things I want to pay attention to as we start framing this up with our camera is the composition. So I plan this very carefully with the concept painting so that your eye would kind of attach to one linear object and move through the scene and then connect with another and then kind of move around. So everything's been deliberately placed in such a way that you've kind of got this circular pattern happening with the layout. And I don't want to lose that by forgetting to, you know, point things in the right direction and all of that. So one of the things we want to be aware of as we place the camera and then other objects in the scene is that we're kind of paying attention to that. So I want to kind of rotate this a little bit like that. I can't even really see this object right now. Okay, so I just want to make sure that it is there. Yeah, okay, it's there. All right. So something else to be aware of, the placement of the spoon and the teacup and everything else right now is not where we need it to be. So what I need to do is get a pivot in the right place. In this case, I'll select one of these points down here. And I want to make sure I have all of these objects selected. I'm using the 3D cursor as my pivot point. Now I want to rotate this until everything kind of falls back into place. And in this case, I need the handle to be pointed more this direction. And then I actually need the spoon to come more this direction. This is actually going to also be kind of placed further along the inside of this cup. So I'll probably just move that over. And we'll have to spend more time later kind of getting this into place, but it needs to be on the opposite side of the cup and then kind of leaning back towards that inner wall. So you can see how that's laying there. It's a little bit closer to the original intent of the shot. In this case, we might also move Move the sugar bowl a little bit. So I'm looking here, but I really need to be looking here in terms of how that's laying out. So I don't want this to be right on the edge because it's going to create a weird tangent. So I just want to be aware of where this is sitting. And the idea is the spoon's kind of pointing towards, you know, the sugar bowl or the currency, and that leads into the maps, and the maps kind of curl around the crack, kind of brings you back into the shot, and then eventually that reconnects back up with the fountain pen. So all of that needs to kind of flow together in a good way. Okay. So I think that's a good start. What we need to do now is save. Before we get really going, I'm going to create a render here. Now I've set this up to be a specific size so that later on I can render this out in an 11 by 17 tabloid size poster. So the resolution is set so that that aspect ratio is maintained. So I'm not going to play with these. I'm just going to lower this down to something like 50%, and then let's render this out. Now the render settings are at 100 samples, so this will be a little bit less noisy than before. Let's see if I've also got denoising turned on, which is a newer feature of Cycles. So that will help remove some of the noise that's happening here, so we don't have to crank the samples up as we go. And this is good to do every now and then, just to get a better preview of how the shadows are playing and what's happening in the scene. Now all of this is going to change. We're going to spend time getting in here and tweaking things as we go, but it's good to start off with a good footing and a good place in each area. So what we'll probably do from here is go in and play with some of the coloring of the lights if we want to do that. We can also play with some of the shaders and start getting those, trying to incorporate the base materials that need to be. So anything that's metallic, we make it look kind of metallic with a proper color. Anything that's liquid, get some transparency and some glass in there and things like that. So yeah, this is basically where we're starting off. So right off the bat, there's some things we want to take a look at. This area down here is just kind of completely lost in shadow, and that's right underneath the journal. So we may want to play with kind of brightening this up a little bit on that corner. Same thing over here with this corner. They're the only two places of the image that is pretty much completely blacked out. Get a little bit too dark here in this shadowing on this maps. So we just want to be aware of all that because you don't want anything pure black as we start to shape things. So as we blow this up a little bit and we render it, you can see much more refined shadowing and how this is being previewed than compared to here. I think most of this is in place in terms of the effect that I'm looking for. We might want to soften this shadow up just a little bit because I don't know if I want it that harsh. The rest of these are looking pretty decent though, and kind of doing what I want. So we're losing a little bit of things, like we can't see the postcard at all right now, but that's going to be a completely different material back there, so it will show up. And then we're also losing this little ticket that's on the on the journal up here. It's pasted in or whatever. We also just want to look around and make sure that we're not leaving any spaces completely open that are kind of boring. So we do have some negative spaces, good, but it needs to be planned. You need to make it happen in a way that's interesting. So it may look like a lot of negative space here on the journal, but there's actually a whole lot going on in terms of visual breakup on the texture. Same thing here on this area, and everything has a lot of texture to it in terms of printing and stuff like that on these objects. And in this composition here, we've got things a little bit more tightly drawn up. So there's less negative space here than there is in our current composition, if you look at this. And so we need to kind of be aware of that as we plan. All right. So before we get moving, I'm going to tighten up some of these areas in terms of the shadowing so that those are a little better off. So we mentioned that this was a little harsh. So to fix that, I'm going to turn up this to maybe something like a 0.75. Preview that. It's also really important to make sure you know where that shadow is actually coming from and making sure that that's projected from this lamp. So if we want to check that really quickly, all we have to do is hide this and that shadow should disappear. And in this case, partially does, but we're getting an effect from another lamp in this case. Let's unhide that. Let's check this back area lamp and see if that's what's causing this harsh shadow. So we'll hide that. So in this case, it's not that. And you know what? With that turned off, I actually kind of like the way this is happening a little bit more back here. So maybe we just lower the intensity of this one quite a bit. Too much in the middle and it's going to seem like it was an accident. So we need to pay attention to what we're doing. Okay, that's kind of interesting. We'll try that. Still something happening right there that's causing that shadow. So let's see if it's this one. It's not that one. Join all of these mesh planes back here into one single object. Okay, well, something is causing this. Maybe it's multiple light sources. So in this case, we hide this one. Okay, see now that we turn the area lamp down, hid that one, it did have a bigger effect. So let's crank this up to something like 2. Interesting. Maybe 4. It's a really diffused shadow happening here. Maybe a little too much. Let's go down to 3. Okay, let's test render this. Okay, so I'm going to use a different slot. So I'm going to jump to slot 2 so we can compare. And then let's render again. Same settings, just different lighting at this point. Hope everyone is doing well tonight, getting pumped for the weekend. I'm excited. Really excited to get moving on the rest of this project. I've spent far too long working on that spoon. So, including today, it was a big sculpting day. All right, so checking things out. If we switch back to the other one, we can kind of see what's changing with the lighting. So we took that area lamp down in intensity, kind of changed the position a little bit. We also lowered the, changed the softness of the shadowing here on this lamp. So that lowered the intensity a little bit, but I think it's making a little bit more of an interesting composition here. So a little bit more moody and instead of this one. So I think I like what that's doing. So we're gonna have to play with this a little bit. It's starting to feel a little bit more like an overhead lamp, and I don't necessarily want it to feel like you know, a light bulb. I want it to feel a little bit more. Yeah, we'll just have to play with it. In this case, we're getting more of a hot spot here, so it's not really what I want. But I like the way this is shaping up over here. Okay. Jump over here and save really fast. All right, we got about half an hour left. So if anybody is in the chat and they have something they would like me to go over as I go, speak up, and I'll be happy to answer comments or questions. So at this point, if anybody wants to respond either on Twitch or YouTube, let me know whether you'd like me to work on materials or continue working on lighting. Either one is cool with me. I can also show you where I'm at on the spoon if you really want to see that again. This would be the 8th stream that I've mentioned it, but I'm listening if anybody's out there. Okay. So save this real fast. Let's take a look at the spoon so I can clear my head a little bit. So it's under T set. So today I spent quite a bit of time working on getting this spoon in a better place and done. So let me jump into a mat cap and I'll show this off a little bit. So last night, if you watched the stream, you saw us go in here and tighten this area up quite a bit. And we worked on creating a retopology of the spoon and then baked a normal map and played a little bit with some cycles settings on that. So if I were to jump into this layer and turn on rendering, pay no attention to anything up here. But if we just look at this area here, you can kind of see where we got last night on this. So it's a decent start for the normal map. And then we talked a little bit about setting up a cycle shader with some variation in the spoon and stuff like that. So if you want to check that out, that's on last night's stream number 7, I believe. But today I went in and continued to kind of get everything into a more finished state with the spoon. So tightened up a lot of the decorations here that you can see on the handle. What I haven't touched yet are the side areas from the stream where we worked on getting things up to a medium level of detail. So I still need to go in here and clean some of these edges up and obviously finish blocking in this right here. Got some areas on the end that need to be finished out and straightened up. But overall, things are kind of coming together in a good way for this spoon. And we will eventually be replacing the generic looking spoon in our current illustration with this one. So we're going to end up retopping everything like we talked about last night and kind of getting that into place. And if I get my substance painter working, we'll jump in there in another stream if you guys want to, and I'll talk about going in there and kind of how to tarnish this up with substance. All right, so that's what I did today, and I'll probably need to work some more on that on the weekend and finish that up. All right, let's jump back into the scene. Okay. Hey, MC25, good to see you in the stream, man. I'm glad you're here. Thanks for commenting. All right, so you got any opinion? Do you want to see lighting more on this scene, or do you want to see cycles stuff, shaders? Let me know. Or if you have any questions, I'm happy to talk about those too. Either's fine. Okay. Then let's jump into some basic materials. That way we can stop looking at this black and white image. All right, we got half an hour. All right, so to get started, we can just go ahead and get some of the really basic diffuse materials done and out of the way. Things like the book, we know are going to be paper. Things like that are fairly simple to set up. So let's start with this interior page material. So we can start by just copying the viewport color that we assigned to the diffuse input there. And that's a really quick way to start to get some color in here and see what's going on. Now, in this case, I think I'm going to want this to be a little bit less green. So play with that, a little bit more of that color. I do want it to be a little bit more yellow because he will have been traveling with this a little bit. And, you know, it's not going to be like printer paper. It's like, you know, it's going to get muddied up, and eventually we'll have to go in here and, you know, texture all this up too. But as a base color, that's probably pretty good. The pages, roughness wise, maybe you want to do something like a 0.3. From this distance, we're not really going to be able to tell anything, but that's a good start. Now, speaking of that, let's zoom in here a little bit and start looking at some of these areas. Okay. So if we are at this distance with the paper, we know the pen, in terms of relative scale, is it's going to give us an idea of what the texture looks like here. This is still too noisy to kind of see what's going on. So let's go ahead and crank the preview up to 100. Okay, so it's refined enough that if we saw any kind of grit, rather than just the sandy type surface, we're going to see that. Now, the higher you crank the roughness, the more gritty that's going to look. The lower you make it, the more smooth the paper is going to be. And that's kind of the way that the basic diffuse works. So we could, if we wanted to get a little bit more parchment type paper, that's a little bit more handmade or something like that, go ahead and jump into a texture, start with the noise. And I want to see what this looks like up close like this. So using the Node Wrangler add-on, if you jump into your user preferences to add-ons, this is a bundle with Blender by default. So if you just type in Node, it should pop up as Node Wrangler. Check that off and you'll have a bunch of new shortcut keys available in your Node window right here. So to preview any of these outputs, all you have to do is Control and Shift left click on an output, and it will create basically like an emission node, and that will let you preview sort of what that looks like on a surface in your cycles viewport. So you can use it to hook things up really quickly, or in this case, I'm using it to preview what this noise texture looks like. So if we crank this up to something large, you can kind of see what that looks like. Now, the issue we're going to run into is that there's not a UV map right now on any of this stuff. So we also need to decide, as we get into doing these base materials, how much of this we can reuse later. So in this case, if I know I'm going to go back into Substance or Photoshop or something like that, I'm going to UV map this, and then I'm going to basically paint, you know, the contents of the journal onto these pages. Do I need to do a procedural material right now with all of this stuff? There's reasons to do that. Sometimes you want to do that if maybe you want to create the underlying material, and then you're going to be, you know, animating, or you want flexibility and putting the writing on top of it with just a transparent image map. That's one reason that you might want to create part of it procedural and part of it texture based. But sometimes maybe you just want to throw on a parchment paper texture from a photo in Photoshop onto a UV map and then import that, in which case we're going to waste a lot of time if we try to build out the procedural map here, right? So we need to think about that kind of stuff as we are planning this together, because we could waste a lot of time on a whole bunch of different materials when we're just going to go back and, you know, paint them up later. In this case, you could also, another use case where this would be helpful is if you wanted to create a procedural material that you could reuse later in another scene, another library, something like that. And then what you could possibly do is UV map this right here and then bake the procedural result into a UV map with a full bake and save that as a texture map. That's something you could do and then use that as a base for painting it up in Photoshop or something like that. That's perfectly acceptable. So you just have to decide what you want to do. Be smart about it, and then kind of work your way through it. So what we're going to eventually try to do with this, if we do a procedural texture, is we're going to want to create sort of a bump effect in this with this right here. Now, if we try to create a really, really big noise pattern on this without any sort of mapping, we might get some weird stretching or something happening as it folds into the middle of this binding. And so we can play with adding a mapping node. Texture coordinate in this case, and play with where this is at. So if I switch it from generated to object, we're going to get an even spread of that all the way across the mesh. Now that will change the scale and what that needs to be the same sort of size. So this will tend to need to be larger or smaller to make a larger texture if you use the object mapping. So we can lower that back down and get the same effect. So it looks like kind of by a factor of 10. It's kind of the way that works. So in this case, we could go small or we could go large and then increase the detail to get some complexity happening there. Could also play with the distortion a bit to kind of get some interesting things happening there. Could really crank this to get some weird sort of effects. So if we make it huge, we're going to get a lot of big wrinkles. And what I want are tiny wrinkles, sort of like this. And so what we can do now is might play with a color ramp. That way we can kind of crush these right here. Something more like that. And we want to plug this eventually into the displacement right here so we can get a bump effect. So if we reconnect this back up, you can kind of see what we're getting now. With the shadowing happening, we kind of get this bumpy sort of effect. Now this is probably way too high. So there's a couple of ways we can get around this being cranked up like this. I like to leave the color ramp as black and white, pure black and white. That way I can tell when I just preview it what it looks like. And then I like to pass that back through another method for reducing the effect here. So there's lots of ways you can do this. You can multiply with a math node to switch this to multiply. And then every time you multiply this, it'll reduce the effect. So in this case, if you multiply it times 0.5, it'll divide it by 2. 0.1 would be really faint, so you can barely see it. You can double it with a factor of 2, and that'll make it really bumpy. And so there's a lot of ways you can get in here and mess with how this looks. Now, just to get a little bit more perspective, let's zoom back out and preview how this is looking. Okay, so I'm looking at this in terms of scale, in terms of how big these wrinkles are compared to this fountain pen. Does this seem realistic? In this case, let's go back to our color ramp. Might want to lower the black so we get a little bit more even wrinkling happening there. Could also even add in another band here and then lower that back down, put it on the other side. So we're getting some of this happening in the middle there. Let's see what that's doing. So multiply is one way you can do it. You can also take all of the inputs in here and then pass them back through another node. So let's say we wanted to pass this back through the color input back, or color output back into, we could even use another color ramp. We could try to do this with something that's visually representational of what's happening. So let's say one of the things we could do is pass this into here and then play with some of these and another color to kind of overlay this. And so if we were to output this right here, let's say we overlaid this color onto white, you're going to get a different kind of effect. Here we're losing a lot of that contrast. If we overlay it on black, you're going to get even more contrast. So you can see what that's doing there compared to here, where it's much more subtle. And in here, we're getting kind of a pitting sort of effect instead of a bumping out effect. It feels like it's going in, like there's worms or something that is eating through this paper. So if you were to put this as something in the middle, I don't think you're going to see a difference. A little bit of a difference, not much. So lots of different things you can do here that are kind of cool. In this case, let's just go back to math. Oops, didn't want to do that. This is the one I want to switch, math. Let's multiply this times 0.2. And yeah, that's fairly subtle. Okay, so I think that's a good start. And just kind of play around with this until we get to what we want. So something to be aware of, you're multiplying this by a factor. Anything less than 1 is like dividing. So basically 0.2 is lowering this down. Now you're lowering everything. So basically think about this. If black is 0, 0 times 0.2 is 0, right? Anything here, we got 1 as white. So 1 times 0.2 is 0.2. So the brightest or the highest level up you're going to get is whatever this value is in this case for the gradient. And then anything in between is a gray value is going to be multiplied and obviously lowered back down. And so the math just happens to work in this case to work out like that. If this was anything lower or anything different than black, obviously that would change how it behaves. So just be aware of that sort of thing. Is you're actually doing math here, and that's how it's figuring out what to put over here. Okay, so I think that's a good basis for that. And then if we wanted to layer like the writing on top of it, all we would really have to do is create another diffuse. And then we take another mix shader here. This diffuse, we could do whatever color the handwriting is going to be, basically. That goes into here. And then the factor would be the image map. So we'll leave it off for now. But if we wanted to pull in an image, we would also have to have this UV mapped. Basically, we would plug the image color or transparency into this factor right here, and it would put it on top. So that's kind of how that would work. So let's kind of zoom out and take another look at how this is coming across in the 3D viewport. So again, from this distance, it's kind of hard to tell that that texture is there, but you know, it's there. So we could start with that same node setup as a basement for the parchment paper. Copy this over, let's delete this, paste this in here. And remember we pulled that color from the viewport color. So we'll copy this into our regular diffuse. Now that's way too saturated. So pull this back down to something that's more saturated than this, but not so much that it looks orange. In this case, the maps are probably a little bit more rough, so maybe 0.3. And we might even increase the bumpiness to be a little bit bigger than over here. So you can also play with the scale a little bit, make that a slightly different size. So let's zoom in, look at how big these wrinkles are compared to over here. play with the distortion a little bit so that it's not looking like the exact same material, right? Oh, okay. I'm actually changing parchment paper, not. Okay. So the maps. Okay. Yeah. Interior pages. Parchment. Yeah. All right. So I was. That's going to make it smaller. In this case, maybe we want to go bigger. Let's look at the edges here and make sure that's not getting too crazy on the, yeah, a little nuts. So we'll need to pull that back a little bit probably. Might even lower the complexity a little bit on the interior pages. We'll start with something like that. Not bad. Okay, 15 minutes left. Let's play with the amber a little bit. This one will be different, obviously, than paper. So we'll do something. Start off with something like glass. Now, glass by itself is going to be fairly taxing on the rendering engine, so you want to keep that in mind and learn how to play with some of these cycle settings so that you can get around some of that stuff. So one of the things you can use pretty easily to optimize the way this is working for a specific material, and you don't always need this, but it can speed things up if you use the light path to kind of pick what things are bouncing in and out of your glass-like materials. In this case, we know that we want our glass to be sort of an amber color. So we can start by copying this into our glass to get going. Again, that's way too saturated. So we need to dial this back until we get something that's a little bit orange in the render, but obviously we don't need to create that here. Now the roughness is not going to be clear. We don't want this to be mirror-like, so we want to turn this up. Now you can see through amber, but in this case, we're going to have to play around until we get something that works. Anytime you turn the roughness up on a glass material, you're going to start getting a lot more noise happening as it bounces through. So that's something to be aware of. So MC25 just asked, when should you use the principled shader? So that's a good question. Principled shader is something you can use for all of the stuff in your scene if you want to do that. In this case, we could even use it here. So if we just went ahead and added a principled shader, it would be the same process for this. So we would hook this up and start with this as our input. Copy there, paste there. And what we'd have to do is play with a mixture of metallic and the normals and the transmission. That's going to go up for something like glass and things like that. So principled BSDF is something that uses something called PBR as the workflow, which stands for physically based rendering. This is a huge answer. I can't go into all of it here. I will probably do a whole course on it at some point down the road. But basically, you need to have specific texture maps to plug into these sections of the principled node to typically use it. Now, you don't have to. You can basically sit here and play with these sliders, and it's just like any cycle shader. You can plug textures and everything else into this. But for a principled shader to function properly, typically you need to have specific maps that adhere to a specific PBR workflow. So there's two types of PBR workflows that you can research that you can get into. One is the metallic rough, and the other is the specular glossy workflow. They behave completely differently, and so you need to know which one you were going to use and then stick with those texture maps so that you are not messing things up when you're creating your shaders. I wish I could spend a whole lot more time going into it right now, but that's the shortest answer I can give you, is that you need to know what you're doing when you use it to be able to use it. And then once you kind of know the process in terms of specular glossy or metallic rough and how those maps work together, then you can go to town and basically create any kind of shader that you want using just that. Now, the benefit of using a principled shader is that with regular cycle shaders, you're going to spend a lot of time doing what we've been doing tonight. You're going to build up all of them from scratch. Now, you can save them and reuse them. So once you've started getting that together, you can, reuse all of your shaders, and that's not a problem. But it takes a while to learn how to build those, right? So unless you're going to be a texture artist, you got to ask yourself, do you really want to spend the time doing that? The other thing is, with using something like cycles, you have the opportunity to create non-physically realistic materials. So let me just quickly switch back to the camera, because I'm talking a lot. All right, so with the PBR workflow, everything is made to work in a physically realistic way. So there are rules in place that make sure that you can't break a material, so that certain things like non-metallic materials, they're never more reflective than a certain amount, right? And then there's just a lot you have to get into and learn to understand how and why all of the PBR works. It's a whole bunch of math, but basically from an artistic point of view, if you're only going to do photorealistic stuff, or you want to make sure that your materials are going to behave physically accurately according to the real world, then PBR or the principled shader in cycles will make sure that that has to happen according to those rules. Now, if you don't use that and you start using other shaders, other shading nodes and cycles, you can break reality in the rendering engine and you can create any kind of material that you want. So examples of that are like, let's say you have something magical that glows, right? Well, that doesn't happen in the real world. So the only way to make that work is to physically break the system and create an unrealistically bright object in the scene, right? Maybe even brighter than the sun in realistic life. And so you want to have those options as an artist. And what the principled BSDF does, along with the PBR workflow, is it prevents you from accidentally breaking things. So if you're just trying to create stuff for a game environment, you're working on, the next Wolfenstein or something for a gaming company, and everybody has to be on the same page and they're creating realistic materials for the real world. You got hundreds of artists working across the globe and they're all building metal and wood and all of that kind of stuff. They need to be on the same page, right? And they need to make sure that the materials they're creating work in the same environment, even when they're not in the same room. They have to know the materials they're generating are going to work across all those levels. Well, the only way they can do that is if they all use the same basic workflow when they're creating their shaders. And so that's why PBR exists, is so that people can create physically realistic materials using the same basic setups, no matter what they're using. Software, settings, any of that kind of stuff, the rules don't change. So you have to follow the rules for it to work. And so anyways, that's a long-winded answer, but that's when you should use the principled shaders. If you're trying to basically just go after the PBR workflow, and you want to make sure that you've got maps that are pre-existing, you're using something like Polygon from Andrew Price, and you've got maps that are already generated for you, you can plug those right into the principled shader and it will work out of the box, right? So then you can just tweak these settings and you won't break anything. If you're more comfortable with cycles and you want to build things that are a little bit more artistically licensed and you can take chances, then you don't have to use the principled shader. And it's important to know I'm still following basic PBR ideas because that's how you get closer to realistic materials. So I still use things like Fresnel. I still make sure that I'm not making anything too bright with too many add nodes or things like that, so that I've got weird emission things happening or unrealistic bump and stuff like that. I'm paying attention, but I'm just loosely following the rules. And I hope that clears that up a little bit. So if you know when to use principled, use it. If not, you should learn about it. And PBR is what that workflow is called. So if you use Substance Painter, Substance Designer, that entire workflow is wrapped up in those pieces of software, and that's pretty much what those are there for. So yeah. Oh, good. Glad it helped. I tend to be a little bit long-winded, so I hope I hope it helped a little bit. All right, so you're welcome. So let's play a little bit more with this glass material. We don't have a lot of time, but basically what we want to do at this point is play with some of the properties. So the roughness might be a little high. It's probably going to vary a little bit as we get into this material. But we don't want it to be so cloudy you can't see in it, because the great thing about an amber fossil or something like that is that you can see into it and to whatever object is embedded inside, right? And so we want to play with that a little bit. I'm not going to make this one a super complex material tonight, but we may get into that later. There's going to be a little bit of a bump here on the material. I don't think I'm going to sculpt one, so I think we might as well just go ahead and add one on the surface. And there's a lot of things we could cake on top of this. So texture is one in terms of the grit of the amber material. We also have like dust that we could cake on top of it. That's something that could work. So let's play with, oh yeah, sorry, forgot. There we go. Thank you for reminding me, MC. Forgot to turn the scene back on. Okay, so yeah, that's kind of what we're looking at. So it's kind of dim right now, kind of dark. If we wanted to kind of break reality like I was just talking about, one of the things we could do is add in some glow to make this emit a little bit of light. And so the way you would do that is grab an emission shader, which you can see if we just plug the emission in, that's kind of what we're getting. In this case, it's going to need to be more amber-ish in the way that we work with it that way. And you don't need a lot to sort of help this out. And then what you can do is a lot of ways to combine these. One way is to use mix and just kind of play with this factor here. So just by adding a tiny % of emission here, we have a little bit brighter material. It's actually adding a little bit of light to the scene. And in this case, we're adding a 0.5%, 5% of this emission to the actual glass material. And you can kind of see if we hit M to mute, M to mute this on and off, you can kind of see what it's doing. It's just brightening up a little bit, not much. So want a little bit more, we can go to 0.9. Now you're going to start washing this out, so you don't want to go tons in with this. That's one thing you can do. You can also use an add shader. So if we were to switch this out, you can use an add shader. And here's where you actually start to break reality, right? Add shaders in general are things that you should stay away from if you're concerned about physically realistic things that aren't lamps in your scene, because they will enable you to go above and beyond what a material's ability to reflect light can do in a scene, right? And so that's where you're going to get this kind of unrealistic thing happening here. So let's shift back to a mix shader. Something like that. I could even play with turning the strength back up or down, depending on what we want to do, and leave that there. But that's the idea. And then if we want to zoom in even further, kind of play with the way that this material is reacting to the light in terms of the surface, right? So one of the things we might want to do is let's go to an area with a bit more contrast over here. We have to wait for the scene to clean up a little bit with the noise because of the glass material. But you can kind of see what it's doing there. And it's the same basic principle. So if we take a texture, we can create some variation on the surface. Now in this case, we maybe want to do something like a Veroni texture. So let's use an object input so that is patterned the same over the entire object. You can pick cells or intensity. Cells kind of reminds me of like stained glass windows. So maybe not the best, but this is interesting. Now you can also invert the color and get sort of a bumpy kind of effect because these are sort of like cells going in. So if you were actually to take this and invert it, you kind of get a bumpy texture on the surface. So we kind of play with that a little bit. Might increase this. And then just by toggling in between with the invert, we're going to flatten this out a little bit more so we don't have to add in like a color ramp or anything like that to start making this a little bit more subtle. And then if we plug this in, you can kind of see what's going on. Now it's hard to tell with the glass just by itself what's happening. So another way to preview this is just to throw on a diffuse node real fast and see what's happening with the shadowing. It's probably a little still too intense. So we might add in another math node, multiply, turn this down to 0.25. So it's not much, but it gives a tiny bit of variation on the surface, enough to kind of break up what's happening and make it feel a little bit more gritty, right? And then you can just layer those effects on top of each other to create weird, interesting, bumpy type of effects. So let's switch that back. And those facets, as they're shifting around, are going to reflect the light differently as a glass shader. So that's kind of interesting. In fact, so much so that we might want to turn this down even a little more. Okay, I'm going to do one more render before we get going tonight. I started a tiny bit late, so I'm going to end a little bit late. Okay, save. Let's do another render. Well, guys, thanks for tuning in tonight. Had a good time working with you guys. Hope you guys are doing well with your Blender scenes. And I invite you to come back tomorrow night at 7 p.m. Central. I'll be doing the last stream of the week. I'm here Wednesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays for right now, and I'm doing 2-hour streams. So if you have anything you want me to cover or would like to ask, you feel free to come back, ask me anytime. Definitely check out theorangeguild.com. There's a link in the description right now that if you use, you can jump in and get your first month free. So check that link out in the description. And I want to thank you for, once again, hanging out with me tonight in the stream. So I'm going to go ahead and let this render, and then we will call it a night. Let's do it. You'll notice too that with noise denoiser turned on, you can get away with a lot more. You have to be careful with it. If you crank it up too much, it can give you some really weird artifacting on your materials. So just pay attention when you're using that, and all will be good. Something feels off. Like it's not rendering the materials. I wonder if I have a default clay shader turned on for everything in the render layer. And I do. Make sure we turn that off. All right, now we can render. Oh gosh. Yeah, there we go. Got some parchment paper going on. So there's obviously a lot more to do with the scene. We're gonna texture all this up. It's gonna be an amazing 3D illustration by the time we're finished. Not sure when that will be, but I'm gonna go as quickly as I can to get you to a good place with it. And then I'm gonna go back and teach a course on it. So that will be good. If you got anything in the meantime you'd like to learn about this 3D illustration that you want me to include in the course, you might drop that in the comments. And I will be reading those and getting back to you guys. So there we go. That is a decent start to the materials we have to work with tonight. And love the new denoiser. You can see it really helps clean stuff up like this glass down here as you go. So yeah, that's a good start. And we will keep going tomorrow night. So I will see you guys there. Thanks for tuning in, and see you tomorrow.